Hey everybody, so today we're going to show you how to change the pads and rotors on your M2 Competition's big brake kit, the stock one it comes with. And this procedure also will apply to other models in the BMW lineup that either have the same or very, very similar brakes, kind of like the F80, 82, M3, M4 with carbon ceramics. The non-carbon ceramics is obviously the much smaller caliper and disc system, so this doesn't apply to that, but let's hop in. Once the car is up in the air, we're going to take our 17mm and undo all of the lug nut bolts. And when we get to the final lug bolt, the wheel's going to want to fall off, so I just use my foot underneath to kind of support it so that it doesn't. Now we can go ahead and grab the wheel and pull it off. So first, let's talk about knowing when you even need to change these components. And we'll start with the most obvious one, which is the brake rotor itself. And if we zoom in here on the hat, you can see BMW kindly has said what the minimum thickness is. So the minimum thickness is 34.4 millimeters. And the way we determine that is we take a pair of calipers and we just measure at a couple points, along the rotor to see if we've hit that or not. If not, then feel free to continue going. BMW typically specifies 1.6 millimeters of wear. So, if you know that you're starting off at 36 millimeters and you're a certain amount above 34.4, well, that kind of gives you an idea of the percentage or the ratio of your rotor life is left. So if we measure this and we measure 35.2, well, that's 0.8 above 34.4, 0.8 below 36, so then I would know I have 50% of my rotor life left. For the pads, you can see that we can just immediately see the outside pad here, and you can see the thickness, how much pad material there is compared to the backing plate, right? So you have the pad material here, and then the backing plate is this metal plate that it's up against. And when that pad gets down to about the thickness of the plate itself, that's when you might think about replacing them. In addition to the outside pad, we should also take a look at the inside pad because sometimes they can wear at different rates. And you can see here, I'm just looking from the top down, and you can see the pad right there. And it's harder to measure that one, but if you look down, we have this little washer on the caliper bracket, and when you see the pad or when you see the backing plate kind of line up with that washer, that's about the same thickness as the backing plate itself, the space between it and the rotor, so that's a kind of good indicator. So underneath the hood, we need to remove this cover, and you can see we have three 10mm cams to start with. And when you unlock these cams, only turn them 90 degrees, and then you should feel a little bit of a stop. It's really easy to accidentally break through that stop and bend that stop, so don't torque it too hard once you get to that point. Once the cams have been undone, come down here to the very side, and we have this little plastic expanding rivet that you can use a trim tool to pull out the center post and then pull it out. And once that last expanding rivet's out, we can go ahead and grab this piece and pull it up and out to expose the brake fluid reservoir. So now what we'll do is we'll want to unscrew the brake fluid reservoir and then take some shop towels or paper towels or something and just put it around here, because what we're going to do is we're going to spread the pads apart. When we do that, it actually causes fluid to go back up in here, and well, if it spills over, you want to make sure to catch that before it can spill on anything else and potentially damage paint. The next thing we're going to do is you're going to want to take a punch and place it right on these two pins, the head of these pins, and then we're going to take a hammer and we're going to knock those out. On the left side of the car, we have this brake wear sensor that we're going to need to remove, and to do that you can just take a flathead screwdriver, kind of get that underneath, and then just pry it out, just like that. Now we'll want to back the pads off a little bit from the rotor so that they're not being clamped against it, and so you can just take a pad spreader tool, get it in there, and then move the pads back just a little bit. Okay, next we have to remove the caliper from the car, and to do that we're going to grab an 18mm and undo these two bolts that secure the caliper mounting bracket to the knuckle. Now you may be asking, like, well, aren't there some bolts up here that connect the caliper to the bracket itself? You're right, there are, but BMW really does not want you to use those when you remove the caliper, and they don't provide a torque spec for those. So we're going to remove these 18 millimeters, or we're going to loosen them, but don't pull them out all the way because we'll need to secure the caliper first. All right, now we're ready to take the caliper off. Before you do that, make sure you have something to support it, either a big box or a bucket or something. You can rest the caliper on here so it's not just hanging by the brake line, or a bungee. You can hook it onto the coil, the spring up there, and then support the caliper, and you can remove the last bolt holding it in. So these things are pretty decently heavy. This thing's about 12 to 13 pounds-ish. And then once that's off, you can see now we can kind of just pull the pads right out. And then you can go ahead and put your bungee through and hoist it up. So let's take a closer look at the pads itself. You can see this is actually a really big beefy pad. You can see they're made by Brembo, right, which the calipers and discs are, well, maybe not the discs, but this is a Brembo brake kit. And you can also see that it looks like Paget makes the compound for this. One of the things you will not notice is you look on the surfaces here, there's no grease. And BMW says, don't put any grease on the sides of the pads or on the caliper itself. Some of their other calipers do use grease, but not these ones. Other features of this pad, you can see you've got these weights up here, and that's to prevent them from vibrating at high frequencies and causing squeal. If you're going to track pads, they typically won't have those. And then we also have a notch here for the brake pad sensor. All right, now we're going to remove the rotor. And to do that, we need to remove these two 5mm hexes. And we'll want to support the rotor when we remove the second one, just in case. You can see how it wanted to come off on its own already. Then we can just pull it straight off. If you haven't changed your rotors in a really long time and they're kind of stuck on there, you can take a rubber mallet and kind of tap around the periphery. So let's take a little bit of a look at the rotors themselves. As I mentioned before, right, on the hat there's some markings that tell you what the minimum thickness is. We can see that this is a drilled rotor, so it's got these holes for cooling. And we see that it is an aluminum hat on the steel rings, or iron rings rather. But if we turn it around and we look at the method by which they're connected, this is not a fully floating rotor. And that's because this iron ring cannot freely move independent of the hat, or rather cannot expand without adding additional stress on the mounting points with the hat. If we look at the side here, we can see that there are a bunch of vanes, and these rotors are directional, so don't put the wrong rotor on the wrong side. Otherwise, these vanes or fins are not going to be pointing the right way, and they won't be cooling your brakes properly. Okay, now we're going to put the rotor back onto the hub, and if you look at the hub, you'll notice there are these three little pegs that have to align in 3 slots on the rotor itself. So make sure that those are all aligned when you slide this back on there, just like that. And then go ahead and take one of those 5mm hex screws and just put that in there to stop the rotor from coming off. Once that's secure, then we can go ahead and take the other one and get that on the other side. And then the torque spec for these two little hex screws is 16 Newton meters or 12 foot-pounds. Okay, now we're going to put the brake pads back inside the caliper. And so you just take the pad, put it in the center, slide it all the way up, and then push it so it's in, just like that. Okay, now we can put the caliper back on. So, make sure you have one of your 18mm mountain bolts handy. I'm just going to put mine up here so it's easy to grab, because we're going to pull the caliper over, and then you're going to need to take out your bungee or whatever you're using to support it. And then we will slide it with the pads onto the rotor, and then get it aligned in the back, and then insert that bolt from the back to hold it. Now we can go ahead and fasten the two 18mm bolts from the caliper bracket to the knuckle, and then these will get torqued to 110 newton meters or 81 foot-pounds. Now that the caliper is all mounted to the knuckle, right, we have our pads in, it's time to put the pins in that secure this. But you'll notice, you know, if I put this pin in, I'm hitting the back of the pad because this hole on the ear is not aligned with that. And what I would recommend is get something non-marring like a trim tool, and then grab the weight here, get it underneath, and just prop that up like that. So you see how I levered this up, and then just keep doing that until you can just get the tip of this pin inside the ear of the pad. And once you have that tip in there, then you can just, you know, grab a hammer and smack that in from the back side. And on the bottom, we'll do the same thing. I'll just lever in there, pull up on the pad till I can get this pin through. This one's a lot easier. And then drive it through to the other side. And then aligning the outer pad with the pinholes is really easy because you can see the pad here, so we can just push up with our hands right like that to make it align and get the pin to go through. And then once we've got the head of the pin index on the other side, just, you know, tap it on the back side until it goes all the way through. So you see how it changed pitches there. It went from a lower to a higher pitch. Once it switches to that higher pitch tapping noise when you're hitting the pin, that's when you know it's all the way in. And another thing, like, you know, these pads, when you rock them, when you press from the bottom to get these to align, it kind of tilts the pad a little bit. So pushing from the other side, so, you know, instead of only pushing up here for this pin, also pushing down here for the lower side to make the pad more square in the caliper can help allow it to move. Now that the caliper is all on and bolted up, we can go ahead and re-secure this brake pad sensor and just push that down into the slot till it stops. Alright, we're going to move to the rear caliper now, and just like the front, we're going to start by punching out these two little pins here. Okay. So, right, just take your hammer and your punch, tap them to get them to come out. And then once you've got one of the pins, you know, out of the far side of the bracket or the caliper, you can go ahead and take your thumb and press down on this spring here, and that'll make it easier because it relieves tension to pull out the pin. And I recommend doing this before you work on the other one, because with this spring unloaded, now getting the other pin out is going to be a lot easier. And then once we've got the pins and they spring out, now we can go ahead and remove our brake wear sensor again. And, you know, once again, we're just going to take our little flathead screwdriver and just pry that off. Now, just like with the front pads, we're going to need a pad spreader, so we'll get that in there, and then we'll use that to move the pads off of the rotor a little bit. And what I'm indexing to is I'm just using the ears for the pins. You can use the top or the bottom, doesn't matter, to press up against. And then the really nice thing about this caliper is the pads just pull straight up, so we don't need to remove this caliper in order to change the pads. And if we look at these pads, once again we can see they're marked Brembo, and that they are also made by Paget, it looks like. And then also if we look at the sides, once again there's really no grease or anything on them, so don't lubricate them. You know, there's no grease on the back. BMW doesn't want you to. So if we're going to take the rotors off, we will need to remove the caliper, and in order to do that, we'll need to make sure that we pop this little cap off the brake bleeder line so that we can remove this wire for the brake wear sensor. Now we're ready to pull the caliper off of the wheel carrier assembly. So we have these two E16 bolts holding that on there, so go ahead and loosen those up, but once again, you know, leave one of them partially threaded so that you can you know, take time to support this or get your bungee or whatever for when you pull this off. Okay, now we can go ahead and take the caliper off of the wheel carrier, so I'll just go ahead and remove that last bolt I had holding it up. Thankfully this guy is a lot lighter than the front, and for this one we can actually just set this on top of the rest of the assembly over here. All right, now the last thing we have to do is take out these two bolts to remove the rotor. Make sure you take off your parking brake before you do this, because if you don't, this is not coming off because the parking brake is applying pressure to the inside of the hat. So we'll take our 6mm and remove these two little bolts, and make sure you support the rotor in case it wants to come off after you do that. And then just like the front rotors, the rear ones have an aluminum hat with a iron ring, and they've got some text on here telling you the minimum thickness. This one is 26.4mm, which means this rotor starts off at 28mm thick. Once again, it has all the vanes. It is directional, so don't screw up your left and right sides. And it's also, not a fully floating rotor, just like the fronts are. And if you look inside here, you can see kind of like this ring of material where actually that's where the parking brake contacts the rotor. So your parking brake has shoes and it expands out and pushes up against the inside of this hat, and that's what secures your vehicle when you pull the brake. Okay, now we'll go ahead and we'll put the rotor back on, and then there aren't any pegs sticking out of this to index the rotor, but we do have those two holes where those 6mm hex screws went in, so we do want to align it to that, and there you go. Once I've got that, then I can go ahead and just start to screw in these 6mm bolts to hold the rotor to the hub. And then once again, the torque spec for these two screws is going to be 16 Nm or 12 foot-pounds. Now we can go ahead and take the caliper, which we set on top, and put that back on. So I'm going to bring that down here, slide it into place, and then take that E16 bolt and just thread it in by hand in the back just to make sure this thing is on there. Now we're going to go ahead and fasten and torque the two E16 bolts holding the caliper bracket to the wheel carrier. And if you're using new bolts, the torque spec for that is going to be 30 Nm plus 90 degrees. In foot-pounds, that's 22 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees. If you're reusing the existing bolts, then you're going to torque it to 110 Nm or 81 foot-pounds. Basically the exact same torque as the bolts that hold the caliper to the hub for the front. They have the exact same thread pitch, M12 by 1.5. Now that the caliper is all mounted up, we can go ahead and take our pads and just drop them in from the top. And then we'll want to kind of start it off by making sure that the holes in the pad ears as well as the caliper are all aligned. Next, what we'll do is we'll start by putting in one of the pins, and I like to start with the bottom just because that's harder to manipulate and deal with later. So we'll slide that in there, making sure it's there. Then you can go ahead and just secure it with your hammer, tap it in. And then you should be able to take the spring clip and actually slide that in underneath the lower pin. So, not putting this in first and then putting the pin just gives you a little bit more room to work with, so that's just why I like to do it that way. Then we can take our upper pin and just get that started, and then we'll bring the spring clip and we will press it down so that we can get this upper pin over it. And once the upper pin is slightly over it, then we can just start tapping it from the back to, get it further over. Then we'll push on the pin itself some more to get it into the ear of the second pad. And once again, we'll go back to tapping it. Now we can take our brake wear sensor, make sure it's captured by the bleeder cap again. And then we can go ahead and press it into that slot on the pad, and then into the channel on the caliper. Now we'll go ahead and place the reservoir cap back on, get that nice and snug, not ultra tight, otherwise you're going to have a heck of a time trying to get it off later. Now we can put this side cover back on. It slots in the centerpiece, and then pushes down over here. Get these three cam locks aligned. And then we'll take our 10mm socket and then turn these cams 90 degrees to lock them. And then don't forget the expanding rivet that goes right here. Then lastly, we just have to take our wheels and put them back on. Then we can take our 17 millimeter and get these wheel bolts back in there. And then we'll torque these in a star pattern to 130 Newton meters or 104 foot-pounds.